Well, glad to be here today. Today I'm going to be starting a series of Wednesday night lessons for those of you who would like some kind of a midweek teaching. Um, I'm Kevin, and if you'd like to email me, you can email me at kwood50322 at gmail.com, kwood50322 at gmail.com. Since I've had a lot of people asking me to kind of address last things or eschatology. Um, Recently, I thought I'd do a series of Wednesday night studies to just be posted on my YouTube channel. And my YouTube channel is Kevin Wood Target Videos. And you'll be able to see the different videos, not just from sermons, but also midweek studies that are going to be available in the upcoming weeks. So today, what I'd like to do is to do a introduction to last things or eschatology, and I'll try and keep the language, the nomenclature as simple as possible. I've been a pastor for almost 40 years, and so I've collected quite a bit of information on this subject because it's always been of interest to a lot of people, and it's surprising to me how many differing views are out there, even among evangelicals. And so there's a lot of evangelicals that will come down in one particular camp or another. They just don't know it because they never had anybody do an introduction to the different schools of thought for last things. And I'll say up front that I'm a futurist. Um, you might want to put me in the category of premillennialist. If that's where you're at and you want to call me that, that's fine with me. I'm comfortable with that kind of a description. But I want to say that up front, that's kind of where I belong. And I'm going to try the best I can not to denigrate any other schools. To just be honest, if you'd like to email, if you think my description of your particular uh, thought or persuasion is not as accurate as you would like, feel free to email me, and I'll try to include that in a later presentation. So today we're just going to do an introduction, and the introduction I'd like to start with is just the broad categories of last things or eschatology that are out there. I will say this, that as I begin, I do believe it's important to uh, look at foundational thinking or biblical thinking, and we're going to get to that in the next lesson or two. I will say this also, that it's important to know the type of literature that we're referencing. And so you could look at gospel narratives like in Matthew 24 and say that it's easier to build an eschatology or a theology on Matthew 24 than it is on Daniel, for instance, or the book of Revelation, because those are apocalyptic type of literature. And so we're not going to treat those as the same thing. They are different. And how the kind of hermeneutics or your interpretive approach is going to be different when you're looking at those kinds of literature. So anyway, I'm a futurist, and I'm going to give you the broad schools that are out there. 50 years ago, people talked about postmillennialism and amillennialism and premillennialism, and that was what everybody thought and talked about. And those categories have given way to preterist and futurist categories. And generally speaking, today's preterists, and this may offend the preterist out there, but today's preterists are yesterday's amillennialists. Today's postmillennialists are today's dominionists, and I didn't mention that a minute ago, but dominionists are one of those categories that are out there. And today's futurists are yesterday's premillennialists. And so I want to talk about each one of those categories briefly. Let's talk about preterism. Preterism is, I think, if you were to look at some biblical interpreter who a lot of people have read or used the commentaries, and that's William Barclay. William Barclay would fit into that preterist category, where he would doubt that there is much in Scripture that you could look at and say, well, this has some kind of futurist implication. Instead, he would say that most of the Scripture, that even in Matthew chapter 24, are going to have some kind of an immediate fulfillment, and that the apocalyptic literature that you would have in Daniel or Revelation are not to be taken in a futurist sense. And so that's kind of a broad category, and I may be doing a disservice to William Barclay there in that kind of a broad sense, but nonetheless, I think he kind of fits broadly in that kind of category. And if you're a preterist and you're out there and you want to argue with that, feel free to send me an email and we'll argue about that. I said also that you have this broad school of postmillennialists that transitioned into dominionists. And it's kind of odd because you don't run into many dominionists, but you used to run into a lot of postmillennialists. And so let me give you dominionism real quick. Dominionism is the concept of the idea that the world is not fit for Jesus to return to, and because the world is not fit, Jesus won't return until the world is fit. Theologically, these people tend toward theocracies, and when I say theocracy, that means God rule, or they want to establish a theocratic government. And so the dominionist approach is going to attract people who can be militant, and not always, but they can tend toward militancy. And so as a consequence, I don't know if it's the safest place to be, but nonetheless, that's a perspective that is out there. And there are people that are dominionists out there that feel like it's their job to make the world fit so Jesus can return. I have real problems with that kind of an approach, but that kind of post-millennialist or dominionist approach is out there. Just thought I'd let you know. And then you have the broad category of futurist. And the futurists today, you would say, well, the futurists on one end and then the preterists are on the other end of things. And perhaps you have guys that are tending more toward the middle, and they'd say, well, there are elements in the scripture that are obviously have already been fulfilled and were never intended to be. And they might say this about apocalyptic literature like the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation. They would say, well, that's apocalyptic literature, and so as a consequence, you could never look at that in a futurist sense. That's not the purpose of that kind of literature. And that's okay. If you've got a preterist who's going to come down with that kind of an opinion, but then also say about, for instance, Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse, that one is obviously futurist, I'm comfortable with that, and I could live with that kind of an interpretation. So it's kind of a middle ground between the futurist or the preterist perspective. As I said, I'm a futurist, and so that's going to be where we spend the lion's share of our time. And when we actually get to the point where we're looking at Scripture, that's going to be the presumption or my bias in how we approach that particular Scripture. But there will be times, for instance, if we're looking at, Daniel or Book of Revelation, chapter 12, there will be times when we look at those passages that I will say, well, this is obviously something which has already occurred, which had a previous fulfillment, that when the writer of this apocalyptic literature, they had this circumstance in mind, and I'll be forthright about that. However, I would never say that that's the entirety of the book of Revelation, or that's the entirety of the book of Daniel, because I don't believe that to be so. So let's get to futurism. Futurism, I would hasten to say it has been the lion's share of evangelical thought for the last 50 years. But the more I'm around certain evangelicals, the more I run into preterists. So, it's hard to say for sure one way or the other. But that being said, most of the evangelicals, most of the Baptists I run across are futurists. In the old days, futurism was kind of categorized or encapsulated by what we called dispensational premillennialism. And dispensational premillennialism was Darbyism. I think it's safe to say that dispensational premillennialism was a 19th century a product of the 19th century. And it became popularized because of the old Scofield Bible, which had this kind of exhaustive chart in the back of the Bible. And many people from 100 years ago became dispensational premillennialists just because that chart was in the Bible and they thought it was scripture. So it became an extremely prevalent view in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and still persists to this day. So if you talk to certain evangelicals, and you were to say something like, or they were to mention to use something about the church age or something like that, well, that would immediately you would know what they're talking about, because that's part of that whole dispensational premillennialist view, which was so prevalent. I will say this, that um, many futurists today are not comfortable with that approach anymore, even though it was, by far the predominant approach 50, 60, 70 years ago. I think to a large degree, there's very few, well, I don't know, very few. It no longer is the predominant view that it used to be. Most evangelicals then that I run with are going to be, they're going to tend more toward the simple premillennialism or futurist perspective. And you have to be careful about that, because when you say premillennialism, they're going to assume that what you're talking about is some kind of a pre-trib rapture, and that is not true, because there's a wide range of people out there that are futurists that are not comfortable with the concept of the idea of the rapture at all, or at least if there's a rapture, it's not a separate event from the second coming of Christ. And so those definitions have to be defined. And I'm just going to say this about myself, so you'll know it up front before we actually dig in and start doing some interpretive work, or the hermeneutics of talking about last things, is I'm going to be a futurist and a premillennialist, but I am going to conflate the concept of the rapture with the second coming of Christ. And I think that tends to be, I would guess that tends to be the prevailing view today, whereas 50 years ago that would not be the case. One more quick word about dispensationalism is, dispensationalism, as I said, was a late 19th century, 20th century product of that whole Darbyism movement, which ended up in the Scofield Bible with the charts and all that, and so it was prevalent for a while. But the major critique of Darbyism or the dispensational premillennialism is that it had no foundation among early church fathers. And so if you were to search Origen or some other early church father, or Clement, you would not find an antecedent for the concept or the idea of a dispensational approach to Scripture. That would not be there. And so I think one reason why, as scholarship has increased, especially among Baptists, as scholarship has increased among Baptists, then Baptists have certainly tended away from the concept of the idea of dispensationalism, simply because it's not an early church concept, or if it is there, I mean, any concept or idea about dispensationalism is going to be pretty tenuous. And so it is safe, however, to say that there has been a movement away from that to simple futurism. And so simple futurism is going to be definitely what we're going to be at in this study today. And that's kind of why I'm offering you this introduction today, so that we'll kind of know where we're going. So to give you a broad overview then of what we've just said, I've given you a variety of different schools of thought. We've talked a little bit about the prevailing opinions today about being the difference between futurism and preterism. And I've given you the concept and the idea that most evangelicals are going to lean toward futurism as opposed to preterism, and some people are going to be somewhere in the middle, and that's okay. I gave you one of the scholars or commentary writers who tended more toward preterism, and there's just a ton of people out there that are going to tend toward futurism. And we're going to look at some of the thoughts of those different people, and we're going to try and approach Scripture hermeneutically from an approach of a futurist that takes into mind or into consideration some of these views that are out there that now are quite popular. And we just want to ask the question, when we look at some of these different views, what are their basic assumptions? I am going to say that one of the basic assumptions that is a troubling tendency, and it's been a troubling tendency ever since the days of dispensationalism, is that it tends to be Western centric or focus on Great Britain or Western Europe or America. And having traveled extensively, especially in Eastern Europe, and having talked to many believers from Eastern Europe, this idea that our eschatology should be Western centric is considered by a large part of the world a bit foolish and silly. And so, one of the presumptions I'm going to have as we do this series of just Bible studies on last things is that we're going to try and move away from a Western centric approach and try to move toward an approach that might have been a early church, first century approach, view the scriptures not from the West, but simply from the place where scripture originated, from their perspective, what the world looked like at their time, and not our own assumptions about us being the center of the world or the universe at this particular time. So that's the first introduction. We'll continue with actually looking at some scriptures in the next video, which we do down the road.